Hey everybody, welcome to our first day in Adobe After Effects. It is a little bit different than Photoshop, but there are a lot of similarities, so hopefully we can get along pretty easily in this program, or a little bit easier than we did in Photoshop if you had no experience inside Photoshop. So if you launch the program, you should get this nice little landing page initially. And if you've never launched the program before, yours might look just a little bit different than mine. I have a whole lot of projects that I've been working on. So these are all populated at the bottom of my initial page here. Also on the left side, you'll see options to start a new project, open a project, or work with team projects. We will not cover team projects in this class, but hey, it might be something that you want to look into later if you're going to work in a group or maybe work on a very large project that needs a few people. Okay, so let's go ahead and click New Project and we'll get into the actual program. And I want to show you just a few things in here before we actually get started. Here's your project window. If you've ever worked inside Adobe Premiere before, you should be familiar with the project window. If not, that's okay. In the project window, we can import footage, we can create new compositions, basically any kinds of items or files that we're going to work with will be populated in the project window. We can go and then maybe alter those things or bring in new things here. Underneath, we have a layers panel. So layers panel, very similar to layers in Photoshop. So it's going to work the same way. The uppermost layer is the thing most visible. It's towards the front of the screen for us, I guess you can say it that way. Underneath it, layer 2, underneath that, layer 3, and eventually, you can have almost infinite layers. I've never run out of layers in After Effects or Photoshop before, so I'm sure there is some kind of limit, but I'm sure it's in the several thousand, so probably not anything that we're going to reach, at least not in this class. Up here is the composition window. So you can also see layers in the composition window, and this is probably the biggest hurdle or issue that new people have with After Effects, that you accidentally double click a layer in your layers panel and then you're just seeing that layer instead of your composition. Your composition is what you're going to end up exporting. It's going to be the final video product. It's what you're creating, right? So a composition, bunch of different video elements or shape elements, elements that you'll put together to create a project. Another thing that you have connected with your layers panel, you have a timeline here. We didn't really experience that at all in Photoshop, but since we're working with video elements or animations that take place over time, there is a timeline, and you'll find a playhead at the top of it where you can scrub backward and forward, or play, or pause, or play in reverse, or go frame forward, frame backward. There's an option for you to zoom in and out on your timeline. It looks like two little mountains and then one little mountain, and you can go towards the smaller end or the larger end to see more or less of your timeline. But you can also use the plus and minus on your keyboard as well to do the same exact thing. On the right side, you'll find maybe a bunch of tabs. I'm not sure exactly what's on the very initial launch of After Effects. You might have more or less than I do here, but if you want to add like effects and stuff to your videos, effects and presets are here. You can search for those things. Again, if you've worked in Premiere before, you probably are very familiar with a lot of these effects. Also things that you might be familiar with from Photoshop in terms of like adjustment layers and stuff. That is all in the effects and presets. So if you wanted to add a hue and saturation to one of your layers, one of your video layers, you can search for hue and saturation, and that's going to pop up there. You just click, drag, and drop it onto your layer, and then you can adjust it inside the effects controls area. So if this seems a little bit overwhelming or a whole lot of things, oh, there's one more thing. So one more thing at the top here, you have a toolbar, so very similar to our toolbar inside Photoshop. Considerably fewer tools than in Photoshop. Photoshop has a ton of tools, but still quite a few. And just like Photoshop, there are little drop downs, and you can find tools underneath the regular tool. So if you're looking for the pen tool, the pen tool's here, but if you don't have the pen tool, you might have it on like the convert vertex tool or something like that. Click and hold and you can find the alternate versions of these tools. Okay, so if this seems a little bit overwhelming to you, yeah, there's a lot of stuff and I went over it pretty quickly, but we aren't going to use all of that stuff right away. Instead, we're just going to work very simply by animating a line. So a nice simple animation, and then we'll make it a little bit more complicated for for the end of the day. So let's go ahead and create a new composition. There's a bunch of different ways we can do it. We can click this button, big button in the composition window that says new composition. We can also click this little button at the bottom of the project window that looks like a film strip with some shapes in there. And if you hover over it, it says create a new composition. You can also go to composition, new composition, or you can press Control N. So just like in Photoshop, there's a million ways to do any given task. So I'm just going to click this big button that says new composition, but you can do whichever method works for you. I'm going to go ahead and rename this and call it line animation. Okay, and then I'm just going to make sure that it's 1920 by 1080. So under pixel aspect ratio, we have selected square pixels on, and that's going to be the standard for all of our projects in this class. Chances are you won't pick anything but square pixels, but there are other options here, and they're basically there for older style video. So if you went out and shot video on a tape, like a mini DV tape, and you wanted to work in After Effects for that, there are options for that. Also, if you shoot anamorphic or something, so if you're using like $30,000 lenses, there are options for that too. But generally speaking, if you're using phone footage or basically any kind of modern camcorder or camera, it's going to be square pixels. Okay, frame rate. This is kind of variable. If you're an animation person, maybe you're closer to the 30 frames per second. So if you drop down there, you can see 29.97. And maybe that makes more sense as an animation person, but since I'm a film person, we're just gonna kind of stick with the regular film frame rate, which is 23.97, 24 frames per second if it's actual film, but for video, 23.976 is generally what we use. Where it says resolution here, this is kind of dependent on your computer and your computer's hardware, right? So After Effects is very taxing on a computer, and it kind of depends on what the project actually is and how large of a resolution it is. If we're working in 4K, obviously that's going to be more taxing than full HD or 720p or something like that. So you can actually turn down the resolution, and this is just the viewing resolution. It's not what you're actually going to export, just to make your computer run a little bit faster. I have mine set at 1/4, but I could definitely go full for this particular project. And this isn't something that we can't just like flip off and on very easily. So like if you start running at full resolution, you decide, wait a second, this is taking too long or playing back kind of choppy and stuff, we can always bump that down a little bit to have an easier time for our computer. Okay, duration matters. It's not too difficult to make your composition a little bit shorter. It's really, honestly, very, very fast to do that. It takes just a little bit longer to make it longer, like your composition longer. So if you have to err on one side or the other, err on the side of too long rather than too short. But either way, it really doesn't take too much time to correct. So I'm just going to set mine to 15 seconds. So that's what we have here with the numbers is frames are these last two numbers, then seconds, then minutes, then hours. So just 15 seconds is probably just fine for this particular project. Background color. So the background of your composition can be whatever color you want. I'll just go with black for now, but consider what color your background is when you draw your line, right? So if I have a black background, I don't want a black line, or I'm not going to be able to tell what's going on at all. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press OK. There are some other things in here, right? Time code, we honestly don't have to worry about that at all. You'll only have to worry about that with video projects that have a time code kind of embedded in them and you want to match. Also, there are some advanced and 3D renderer stuff. We'll get into the 3D renderer much later in the class. So let's press OK and we'll have a new composition. We see that that is now populated in the project window, and we have all these options now. Our toolbar is now open. We can use all the tools there, and we see that the timeline's kind of lit up. We can see that we have a playhead now. That's that little blue arrow looking thing at the top of the timeline. We can scrub backward and forward, and across the timeline we can see we start at 0 seconds and we end at 15 seconds with 2, 4, 6, 8 all along the way, where we can see just how long our animation is taking. We have no layers yet, and there's a bunch of things up here, but we're not going to worry about any of that stuff yet. We'll get into it later. So we want to start drawing our line, but before we do that, a good kind of workflow is just to save this thing, and save pretty often, because After Effects is known to crash a lot of computers. We don't have too many problems at Webster, but if you're at home and your hardware isn't, perfect for After Effects, sometimes it will crash your computer. So we want to make sure we save it before we do anything, and then pretty consistently save along the way. So if you feel at any point you've done a lot of work and you wouldn't want to lose it, just press Control S on your keyboard or Command S if you're on a Mac. So let's go ahead and save this real quick. I'm going to click File, Save As, and then Save As. It's Control Shift S on your keyboard if you want the shortcut. Then I'm going to navigate to someplace where I can save this thing, and I'll just call it Line Animation. Okay, and I will save it, and that saves as an AEP. AEP is a lot like a PSD, right? So PSD has like all of your layers saved, all of the adjustments that you made. So if you open that PSD in Photoshop, you can alter whatever your project needs altering, right? In the AEP, it's the same kind of thing, except what it doesn't store is any video footage that you've imported. So if you create things in here, like our line animation is all just going to be a line that we create inside After Effects, that's all going to be saved inside the AEP. If we bring in some footage, that footage isn't saved in the AEP. That's a way of just keeping the After Effects project file very small. We can email it to ourselves and stuff, and that's all nice and easy. The footage would need to be saved in a relatively similar path, right? So it needs to be saved on the same place on different computers if you're going to pass the AEP back and forth. Or if it doesn't work, you can just kind of relink it. And if you ever have any trouble with that, I can help you out with that. Okay, though, let's go ahead and draw ourselves a line. So we've used the pen tool before. The pen tool works the same way as it does in Photoshop, so that shouldn't be too hard for us. So as soon as I click the pen tool, you'll see that I have properties for the pen tool on the side of the toolbar. We have options for fill, and we have options for stroke. So as soon as I would start drawing with the pen tool, it's going to think that I want to create a shape. So that is a little bit different than Photoshop, where we define, do we want it to be a shape? Do we want it to be a path? Do we want it to be a selection? Here it thinks shape initially, unless you have a layer selected, in which case it will think you want to create a mask. So it's a kind of way to keep the workflow easy, but also can be a little bit frustrating if you accidentally have a layer selected when you didn't mean to. So we don't want to fill it all for our shape because we want it to be a line. We don't want it to be a filled out shape. So I'm just going to click the blue text that says fill, and then I have the option to select a little strike through. That's none, so no fill here. If I click OK, then I can see my fill now has that strike through. Now, if you want to be able to toggle through fill options quickly, if you hold an Alt on your keyboard, I'm not sure what it is on a Mac, but Alt on your keyboard for a PC, and then click, you can shuffle through solid color, linear gradient, radial gradient, and then no fill at all. Okay, on stroke, we have already it's selected for me, white, and white looks good. White on black looks nice, but if you have a white background, maybe you don't want white on white, so you can actually see what you're doing. And you can choose whichever color you'd like for this. And I'm going to turn up the stroke width just a little bit so I can see it better, and you can see it better at home. So I'm going to zoom in. So Control plus and minus zooms in on your not your canvas window, on your composition window. So I can see my composition just a little bit more clearly. Also, if you're using a mouse at home and it happens to have a scroll wheel, just scroll wheel up and back, or back and forth, and you'll zoom in and out. After Effects is great with a mouse, so that scroll wheel is just excellent in here, where you can zoom in and out. It really helps when we get to like rotoscoping and stuff. Also, if you click your mouse wheel like it's a button and move around, it automatically selects the hand tool and can kind of move your composition around a little bit more easily. I'm just on the trackpad right now, so I'm working a little bit more clunky than you. Unless you're working on a trackpad, in which case you're working a clunky way too. All right, so I'm going to take my pen tool, and my stroke is white, and it's 6 pixels. 6 might be okay. I can always turn that up later. And I'm just going to start creating a line. And I'm going to use Bezier paths, and I'm going to create a very complex, very large line. And it can cross over and pass through itself. Any of that stuff's just fine. What we don't want to do, though, is we don't want to connect our last point with our first point. We just want it to be a line. So if I did this, that's creating a shape, and we don't want to finish out our shape. By the way, Control S is your best friend in this program, so that's save. But Control Z is your second best friend, so that's undo. So if you do anything that you're not sure what you did, but it's not something good or not something that you intended, Control Z can definitely help you out in that regard. All right, so this is getting nice and complicated for me. And the idea isn't that I'm going to have a very long, complicated line, but this is going to be the path that my line takes as it's animated. So think if you've if you're as old as me, there's a game called Snake, right, that was on old Nokia cell phones and stuff. It's kind of like that, right? A small line that kind of traverses our video window. Okay, so here's a nice, complicated, long line. All right, and we're going to rename it now so we don't get confused about all of our layers. We really just have one layer, but it's good policy to rename your layers and keep things organized. So if I want to rename a layer, again, remember, if I double click a layer, it wants to take me into a layer window. In this case, since it's a shape, it won't do that. But if you double click, it's not going to give you the option to rename your layer like it does in Photoshop. Instead, you have to press Enter on your keyboard with a layer selected, and then you can rename it. So we'll just call this line, and I won't get confused anymore. All right, so we're like halfway done with this animation already. Isn't that crazy? We're going to twirl down on our line layer. So that's just that little arrow here. Remember our nomenclature from Photoshop. It's the same thing. We're going to twirl down for things, and we're going to shy things out. We can also lock layers just like in Photoshop. But we're going to twirl down on line, and we're going to see this little option here that says add, and it looks like kind of like a play button. So these are animation effects that we can add to shapes and lines. So we're going to click that, and we're going to use the trim paths option. Okay. So once I have trim paths selected, I can see now that there is a trim paths under contents underline. And if I twirl down on trim paths, I can find start, end, and offset. Now, if I mess with these things, you can kind of see what they're going to do. So my start point is at 0, so at the very beginning of our line. And if I turn down the end to 0, 2, you can see my line becoming erased and erased and erased until it's at 0. So any of this blue text, you can click and drag right or left, and that's the kind of like, I guess, organic way of working with it. You can certainly also just click it and type in a specific number. So if you wanted to click and type 0, that would be a little bit faster for you. But if you're just trying to like eyeball things and find out what looks good, click and drag left and right, and that should do it for you. So we're going to set both of these things at 0 initially, and then what we're going to do is we're going to toggle on keyframes. So keyframes are just very specific values for specific properties, and in between keyframes, After Effects will animate just kind of a linear path, right? So let me show you what that is, and then maybe you'll understand it a little bit better. So we're going to toggle them on by clicking the little stopwatch icon for both start and end. And you'll see on your timeline now that you have two diamond shapes, and those are keyframes. And for those keyframes, at that very spot, we have 0% and 0%. But if I move down, move my playhead down just a little bit, I'll move it to, let's just go about 6 seconds. And then I will only animate my start value. So I can add a new keyframe by clicking the little, it looks like a diamond icon on the side of start. So that will add another one right where my playhead is. But also, like, if once you get into this and once you want to like actually work a little bit faster, if you make a value change, it's automatically going to add a keyframe wherever your playhead is on your timeline. And this does get a little bit troublesome for new people to the program. Whatever value change you make, it's going to create a keyframe wherever your playhead is. So if your playhead is already on top of a keyframe, it's just going to replace that keyframe that was there with a new one with that value that you set. If I, here's where things get confusing. So let me go ahead and add a keyframe for start, and I'm going to set it to 100. And you'll see what it does between two keyframes. So if I scrub back and forth, you can see it now draws out my line. So it goes from 0 to 100. And if you look at start down here, you can see that number tick up. And it ticks up in a very linear fashion. It's not like ramping up faster or slower. It's going an even rate from 0 to 100. And once we hit that 100, it just stays at 100 because there's no keyframe to say you should change from here. Okay. But if I'm somewhere else, I cannot just click this keyframe and then adjust the value. Instead, when I adjusted that value, you see that I have a new keyframe created where my playhead is. So it's a little quirk that is not super intuitive, right? Like what you would expect is you click the keyframe and then you adjust the value and it's going to adjust the value for that keyframe. Nope, not the case. Whatever value adjustment you make, it's going to make it where the playhead is. So this also becomes a little bit troublesome when you try to get your playhead on the keyframe that exists and make an adjustment, but you're not quite there. So here I have two keyframes right next to each other. And if I zoom in on my timeline, I can see that they're actually 2 frames apart. So instead of it going from 0 to 74, it goes up to 0, from 0 to 100, and then jumps back to 74 in 2 frames. So if you want to get around that, that's what these little arrows are for next to that add keyframe button. It's jump to the previous or jump to the next keyframe, so it can place your playhead directly on top of the keyframes. That way, if you make an adjustment, it's going to put that keyframe directly on top of the old one, and you won't have any issues there. Okay, hopefully that kind of makes sense to you. The more you work with it, the more you'll sort of get it. All right, so here's how we're going to make this animation work for us. So our keyframes are at the very beginning of our timeline, and they're both set at 0%. Then pick an arbitrary number, maybe more than 2 seconds, maybe less than 10 seconds. I picked 6, but it's whatever you choose. I'll create new keyframes for both start and end. I can click the add new keyframes button, but instead I'm just going to change the values, and that's going to work for me. So 0, 0 at the beginning of your timeline, 100, 100 at 6 seconds, or however long you decided. Okay, so what's happening now is if I scrub back and forth, you can see my numbers changing, but I can't see any animation actually happening. So remember when I had 0 to 100 for start, that was drawing out the length of my line. And end, if I did the same thing, that would be erasing the length of my line. And since they're both doing both things at the same exact time, it's drawing as it's erasing, and the net result is nothing, right? Like I don't see anything happening. So here's where the magic happens. We're going to go ahead and select the 2 keyframes associated with the end property. So I can click and drag a big rectangle around those 2 bottom keyframes, right? Or I can click one, hold in Shift, and then click the other, and then they're both selected. Now, if I made an adjustment for the property, I would only change the one with the playhead directly on top of it, so that start one. But I can move them around together. So if I click and drag to the right, I'm going to see that now I have exactly what I want, a line that animates. Hey, look at that. So good, we're kind of there, but we can make some alterations if we want. So if I sit in the middle of my animation area, right? So after my line has started to be drawn out, but before it's reached the end and erased itself, I can actually see how long my line will be based on how far I offset my keyframes. So you see how start and end are now offset. The longer that they're offset, the longer my line will actually be. And the closer they are, the shorter my line will be. So it's totally up to you what you decide to do here, but I like a nice short line. Also, if this pathway, you see that blue line that's kind of chaotic in our animation here, if that's getting in your way at all, in your composition window here, towards the bottom, you'll see toggle mask and shape path visibility, and it's probably highlighted like it's on. If you click that, it'll turn off, and we can actually see what's going on here now. So if I play that back, I'll get a nice, quick line animation. All right, looks pretty good, but let's say my line's moving much too fast. If I want to slow this stuff down, to slow an animation down that has keyframes, all you have to do is move the keyframes further apart. So the idea is it's going from 0 to 100 over the course of 6 seconds, but if I move it further down the timeline, it'll move the same amount, but over a longer period of time. So the perception is it would get slower, right? So if I take my start and move it down the timeline, that'll make it slower. And if I take my end and move it down the timeline, that would make the erasing part slower. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select both of my end keyframes and move that down the timeline a little bit. And now we'll see it's doing the same exact thing, but it's moving slower. Still pretty fast, but slower than it was before. Okay, and now we have our animation basically done. That was pretty easy, right? I'm going to make it a little bit harder on you for your homework, but a line animation. You've created your first After Effects animation. Congratulations. But maybe we don't want this big black space at the end. So it animates and it looks good, and we like where it is and when it finishes at 12 seconds, but our animation's actually 16 seconds long, and we don't want 4 seconds at the end of our animation where nothing's happening. So if I was going to export this, which I'm not, but I can grab our work area handle. So the top of your timeline here, time ruler, if you hover over it, it's this big gray bar. You can see blue handles on the edges, and you can click and drag and pull that inward, and wherever that is, now you can see that like part of your timeline is highlighted. I'm not sure if you can see it on my computer very easily, but that is what you're actually going to export. So if you need to trim off the edge just a little bit, you can do it super simply, right? If you need to expand it, make it longer, there's an option for that. It's just a little bit harder. If you go into your project window, right click on your composition that you've created, go to composition settings. Here's all of that information that we had before that we set up when we started the project. But let's say we actually needed not 15 seconds. Excuse me, I was saying 16 seconds before. It was 15. If we actually needed 20 seconds, we can reframe that, change it to 20 seconds. Now if I zoom out on my timeline just a little bit, I'll see that now I have 20 seconds to work with. So if I needed a little bit of extra time, I could do that. You'll notice too, though, that my shape layer that I created was only made for 15 seconds. So I'll have to grab that handle and stretch that on out to have access to that full 20 seconds with my shape layer. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming for you. Hopefully you got a nice line animation, because we're going to do something just a little bit more difficult. We need to navigate over to Canvas under Files and download a video called Guy Looking Around. So download that for me, and then we'll jump back into the program. You can save this if you want. I'll show you how to export later if you want to export your line animation into an actual video. But I'm just gonna neglect that for the simple line animation. We'll do it for the more complex one. We can create a new project and jump in with our Guy Looking Around video. So File, New Project. All right, and then we are going to import our new footage. We don't have to create a new composition yet. Actually, we can create a composition based on our video settings very easily rather than try to guess at those things. So import our footage. Again, a bunch of different ways to do this. Control I or Command I, depending on if you're on a Mac or a PC. Double click in your project window, right click, go to import. I also think you can go to like File and Import and File. Any of these things is going to work just fine for us. I'm just going to double click in the project window, and then I'm going to go find my footage. All right, there it is. Guy looking around. He looks like a scary orange alien person. This is not my animation, it's just something from online, but it does really help us. So if we look up at the top of the project window, we can see that it's a very low resolution video, 640 by 360. It is that one is square pixels, right? So square pixels for basically everything. It's actually a straight 24 frames per second, and it's 4 seconds and 15 frames. It's also got a codec on it and some sound too, but we don't care about any of that stuff because we can create our composition based on our video by simply clicking and dragging into our composition window, or we can click and drag into our layer panel, or we can click and drag onto the new composition button down here as well. I like to click and drag onto the button, but that's just me. I'm not sure why I like it. You can do whatever you think is best. At this point, we'll go ahead and File, Save As, if you haven't already. And we can call this Line Animation 2. Okay. And then maybe we can rename our layer down here as well. We'll click Enter on our keyboard, and we'll call it Guy. All right. So now we have our composition all set up and stuff. We have our project all set up. We can press Control S at any point in case we're afraid we're going to lose something. And then what we're going to do is we're going to animate a line just like we did before. But if you look at this guy, he looks up and down and left and right and over and back. We're going to make sure that our line matches his vision. And he's not just going around in a circle in like a very linear pathway, right? He's back and forth and slow and fast. So we need to match that so it looks like he's looking at our line at any given point. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Same way we did before, we're going to use our pen tool, and we're going to start where he looks initially, which is dead in front of us. So I just make a point there. I'll scrub forward on our timeline until he's looking in the first like different spot, which is up in the top corner. And it looks like he's basically looking right there. I'm just going to add a Bezier because I know my line's going to go down from here because I watched the video. Okay, so next he's down in the bottom right corner. Then he's down center. Then I think he's down in the bottom corner. Yep, down in the bottom left corner. Scrub forward, and then he's straight to the left. And then he's going to go the other way, straight to the right. Okay, and then it's going to bounce right back to the middle. And when we bounce back to the middle, remember we don't want to connect the line to itself. So we can click and put that really close, but don't let it touch. Okay, so that's the path that it takes, but it's going to be a little bit trickier than this. If we want to change the color or change the size of it, remember up here under stroke, we can change the color to be, maybe we want yellow or not orange, not black, but anything else is probably fine. Then we can change the size of it too if we want to change the size of it. So if we want it to be a little bit thicker, that's just fine. Okay, from here, we'll probably rename this layer. I think that's a good idea. We can call it line. And we can twirl down on it. And just like we did before, we can click that Add Trim Paths. And we're going to do the same thing we did before. We want to make sure our playheads at the very beginning of our timeline toggle on keyframes for both start and end. Turn them both to 0 initially, go to the end of the animation, or not necessarily the end of the animation, but just until his eyes point forward. There's a little bit more time there. Afterwards, set them both to 100 and 100. And then we're going to select the bottom 2 keyframes, both keyframes for the end property. Click and drag until our line is as long as we want it to be. So this is the basic animation for it. Not too bad, but the timing's just a little bit off. And we're going to go ahead and correct that in just a minute. But before then, I just want to show you a couple of things that you can do with lines in here. It moves kind of quickly, and what's really cool in After Effects is that you can turn on motion blur for anything that's in motion. Now this is not a requirement for this this project, but it's very, very easy to do. So you see this little icon here that looks like a ball in motion. It's very small here, but if you click the check box next to the layer directly underneath that button, you'll see that now that little icon is selected on for your layer. And we can look at our line now and see that it looks like it's actually in motion. And this will just make things look a little bit nicer in your animations in general. It's an option for you if you'd like to turn it on. Additionally, if you're working with a line or a shape, you'll find under Contents here, Shape 1, your shape layer actually could contain several shapes. But since it's just this one shape, we have no issues understanding which one's which. But there is options for fill and for stroke and for path and stuff. In this case, we don't have a fill. All we have is a stroke. But if we twirl down on stroke, we can see that we have some additional options. We do have the color, and you can see that the color is actually keyframeable. So if we wanted to do something really wild, like turn on keyframes for color, it starts at yellow, and over the course of the animation, it changes color to maybe red. We'll just switch it to red. So you see we changed the property, we have 2 keyframes, and it's going to follow a gradual path from yellow to red. And maybe red is a bad choice because it is pretty difficult to see over the guy, but maybe we'll change that to green, and that might work a little bit better. So over the course of these 2 keyframes, we'll start at yellow and it'll turn green. And you can do this several times. You can have a keyframe in the middle for yellow to green, and then one to white, or whichever colors you want. Again, preferably not orange, not black, and then we're probably fine. There's some additional options here. Well, stroke width, you can also keyframe, so you can make your line get larger and smaller over the course of the animation, which is an option for you too if you want to experiment with that. Also, you can add dashes. You can change the line cap, which I would probably do for this. It has that like flat looking edge to your line, and you can actually just change that to a rounded edge, and then it just feels a little bit better and stuff. Again, all of this stuff is totally optional. Just want to show you that it is an option. Okay, so our line looks a little bit better now. We certainly didn't have to do that stuff, but we did anyway because it's kind of cool. All right, so let's just twirl back down on trim paths. By the way, if at any point you just need to see your keyframes for any given layer. So in this case, I have keyframes for trim paths, and then I have keyframes for the color. If I ever press U on my keyboard, it's going to give me just the properties that have been keyframed. So I see all 3 of those things, and it's a good way to maybe access certain properties without, seeing a whole bunch of stuff. If your eyes have issues with a lot of small text and a lot of small icons, After Effects is definitely that. So look out for that. And you can just press U on your keyboard and just jump into the things that you actually care about. You would have had to turn on keyframes for these things before you press the U, but U is a helpful hotkey for us. Okay, so here's what's going on now. So our animation is doing what it's supposed to do, sort of, but our line at this point is a little bit ahead of the guy. So here's how we're going to approach this. So he looks the first place that he really looks is up into the right corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my playhead. I'm just going to forget about what the guy is doing. I can even shy him out. So I know that he looks up into the right corner. It's just the timing is wrong for it. And we know our path is good. So what we're going to do is we're going to find that moment where our line is up into the right corner. Okay, and then we are going to set 2 new keyframes. And at this point, we actually do want to use that new keyframe button for both start and for end. And you can see that they're actually right on top of each other. They're not offset like before, and that's totally fine because when we add those keyframes, if you click that button, it's going to create keyframes with the values that were already associated with that spot in your timeline. So if I undo both of those things, if I move my playhead to any given point, we can see the values as they're changing from point A to point B, from our first keyframe to our last keyframe. And if I set new keyframes, those keyframes are set to those values, right? So now I can take those 2 keyframes and I can move them closer or further apart. So remember, the closer 2 keyframes get to each other, the faster the animation will happen. The further apart they are, the slower the animation will happen. So how I'm going to approach this is I'm now going to put my playhead where he's looking in that corner, and then I'm just going to take those 2 keyframes that we've created and move them to that point. Okay, so now it's the same movement. It just takes longer to get there. So that's exactly where he's looking at that point. Okay, I'm going to approach everything this same way. So at this point, my line is in the bottom right corner, and it's just a hair ahead of where he's looking. So I'm going to go ahead and create 2 new keyframes right there. And I'm going to select them. And I'm going to move my playhead just a little bit until he's looking in that bottom right corner. And I'm going to move those keyframes there. And I could do this for the middle as well, because it does look like we're a little bit ahead here. So I can probably just create 2 new keyframes anywhere in here. And help that out. So now he's watching it, looking pretty good. And at that center point, it looks pretty good. But now he's ahead of the line. So I'm just going to make sure that if the center is pretty good, I can set 2 keyframes there and not move them, right? So we know that from here to here is just good, so we don't even have to bother. Now I can jump to the next part where my line is where it's supposed to be, so bottom left corner. But it takes too long to get there this time, so I'm going to move my playhead to where he's looking in the bottom left corner. Then take those 2 keyframes and move them there. So it moves nice and fast once we hit the middle point, and he's looking directly at it. Okay, once again, he's a little bit ahead of our line here. So we just want to get our line in that straight left area. Okay, create 2 new keyframes. Okay, and then when he first hits that straight left area, that's where we want our line to be. Okay, so he's keeping track of it. And then it takes a long time for him to budge off of that straight left. So we can create 2 new keyframes where it's just a little bit off of the straight left, but it's still pretty much in that direction. We can really kind of stretch that out a little bit. Maybe I did just a little bit too far there. Okay, and then at this point, we're ahead of him. Also, it looks like it should just be down a little bit lower. Okay. Take those 2 keyframes. Okay. And that last one looks pretty good, actually. So now when we play this back, it should do exactly what we want. Hey, he's watching that line. Perfect. All right. So hopefully you got the hang of this. Maybe I worked a little bit quicker than you through it. It does take a little bit of time to get used to things. At the end of the day, though, if you don't have this color, we can just like not look at that, pretend it's not there. Um, just start and end. Both start and end keyframes. The first 2 and the last 2, or the first one and the last one for both start and end, should be offset a little bit, and all the ones in between should be like straight on top of each other vertically. And you don't change the numbers at all after the first couple that you do. All of the middle ones, you just click that add keyframe button for the properties and then move those things around from there. Okay, one last thing with this project. We're done at this point, but we want to export it. So we'll go ahead and do that really quickly. How we do it: File, Export, Add to Render Queue. Mine is just taking a second there. All right, there it goes. So now we see a guy looking around. That's what we're going to export. That's what our composition is called, and that's just totally fine. But we want to change a couple of settings in here to make things a little bit easier for us to digest. So under output module, we can click the blue text here. We can also click these drop downs and maybe have some options in here. We can save presets this way and stuff, but let's just click the blue text for now. We'll go into format. We'll change the format to QuickTime, and then we'll go to format options. The first button here that says format options, that's for video. There's another one at the bottom for audio. But what we want is to change the video codec to be Apple ProRes 422. So this doesn't work on like Windows Media Player and stuff, but if you have VLC Media Player, I think it is, yeah, VLC Media Player, that should play back the video just fine, as well as if you upload these things to YouTube and then post a link, which you have to do so that we can see your video. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and press OK now, and it's going to export as a custom QuickTime, but that's just the ProRes 422 that we set up. And then output 2, we're going to click that blue text as well. And we can rename our project here. So if I go to someplace where I can save this thing, that looks good. We can rename it to maybe line animation. Okay, and we see that it's going to be called, it's going to come out as a quicktime.move. Press save, and it's not going to just automatically save as a video yet. We have to click this button on the right side that says render. So once we click that, we'll see it play back, and there's this really great sound right at the end of it. It went through very, very quickly because it's a low resolution, very simple animation. It went back quicker than it even takes to watch. So once you hear that really nice sound, that chime, that means that your project's done, your project's exported, and it's probably looking okay. From here, we're going to go to our YouTube accounts. If you don't have a YouTube account, you automatically get one with like a Gmail account or any kind of Google account. And we're going to upload these videos. We're going to add it as potentially an unlisted video. Unlisted video is fine with me. Don't make it a private video though. A private video, we can't see it unless you give us permission. An unlisted video, no one can see it unless they have the actual link. And then we are going to embed it on Canvas so we can all see your video and comment about how perfect your your motion blur is, and how your animation works perfectly, and it lines up perfectly with this guy's eyes and stuff. So that's it for this week. If you do need help with YouTube or embedding, please reach out to me. It may cause you a couple of issues. It's essentially the same method as what we've been doing with photos in Canvas, except videos take up a lot more space, so YouTube's probably better for us. If you want to use just Canvas and upload things, okay, but it's going to end up causing us some issues because there are a lot of video projects ahead of us. So maybe for this first project, if you just can't get a hang of YouTube and stuff, that's okay for this 1 week. But after that, make sure that you figure out YouTube and embedding there. You can find embed YouTube video link on Canvas. Super easy. You just click or you just copy your YouTube URL, paste it, and then it'll just be popped in there. I think that you could also probably just copy your YouTube URL and paste it in the discussions area, and that's probably going to be fine as well. Then we just have to like copy and paste it ourselves. But embedding is better for sure. All right, that's it for this week. Hope you get along pretty well in After Effects. Fairly simple project and kind of fun, I guess, right? I'll see y'all next week with some more After Effects stuff.